Happy midday. Good to see you. As always, thank you for coming out. I want to thank marketing and video services and the CoLab for always helping us put these on. My name is Michael Carragher, along with Maureen Fitzpatrick. We're responsible for these, one way or the other, however you feel. I want to thank you for your continuing support. This has been another great year of the mini books lectures. And today with Tom, I think we're going to finish up strongly with a nice book of poetry for April.
Don't count on it, but...
Okay,
no.
well, there we go. To begin, Tom Reynolds is professor of English here at Johnson County Community College. He began teaching for JCCC in 2000, but he has served as full-time faculty since 2006. Prior to coming to the college, Tom taught for Fort Scott Community College, Neosho County Community College. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and English from Washburn University and a Master's in Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Wichita State. Tom has taught a number of classes, including Introduction to Writing, Composition 1, Introduction to Literature, and I think one that's near and dear to him is Introduction to Poetry.
Yes.
Aside from departmental committees, he's primarily the faculty sponsor of Mind's Eye, a wonderful student literary arts magazine. Every year they put out just an incredible product. And professionally, Tom is a member of the Sports Literature Association, which, if you know Tom, makes perfect sense. He has a deep passion for sports. When he is not teaching, you will probably find Tom writing. He's published poetry in various literary journals and magazines for the last 40 years. He has also been seen publish 2 full-length poetry collections entitled Ghost Town Almanac and Home Field. Many of his poems also appear in anthologies like Kansas Time and Place, an anthology of Heartland poetry, Begin Again, 150 Kansas poems, and The Shining Years, poems about aging. Today's presentation covers Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology. It's a fascinating long poem and one that's probably not taught enough anymore, I think. It's a long poem. It's a collection of short verses. Maybe Tom will define what that means, from 1950. And if I remember correctly, Masters was born in Kansas. Garnett?
He was.
Garnett,
yes,
Kansas. Not too far.
Yeah.
And Tom says this. He chose the book because it remains a unique, that's certainly true, and classic book of American poetry, and it holds a personal significance with him as well, and perhaps we'll find out a little bit about that personal significance.
All right.
Friends, Tom Reynolds.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. It's a great privilege to be part of the Great Book Series. I asked Michael, and it's actually gone back 8 years. And I have to check with Michael on this, but I believe this is only the 2nd book of poetry that has been presented, number 2. So happy to represent poetry. This is a presentation on Spoon River Anthology by Edgar Lee Masters, and the first was actually presented by Michael, first book of poetry, and that was John Berryman's 77 Dream Songs. And another great book of poetry, and these are very different poets and very different books of poetry, and yet they have certainly one thing in common, and that is they are single volumes of poetry that have lasted, that have stood the test of time. Spoon River was published in 1915, so over 100 years ago. And I think that's true of 77 Dream Songs that you could probably, I didn't check on this, but you could probably go to Barnes & Noble today, and if you're lucky, find a copy of both of these volumes. Edgar Lee Masters wrote many other books of poetry. He wrote books of poetry before Spoon River and some 20-odd books of poetry after Spoon River. And this is the one that has lasted. Probably the only one that reads everything else that he wrote, and he wrote novels and short stories and biographies, including a biography of one of his favorite poets, which is Walt Whitman. But none of those really are read today unless you're a scholar of Masters, probably. This is the book that has lasted. As they say, it stood the test of time. And there are probably various factors why it has stood the test of time, and maybe I'll touch on some of those. It's, as I'll tell you in a moment, set in a small town in the early part of the 20th century. And it's an example of social realism, one of the prime examples of early 20th century literature. It's an example of, to some degree, philosophic naturalism, and we read it for that reason. But that's not why it's still on the shelves, I would counsel. I think it's on the shelves because it's still relevant to who we are today. We don't read it just to find out how people lived in 1915 in a small town. We read it because, like we read Shakespeare after all of these years, ultimately it's about who we are today. It's still relevant. And I read it a number of times over the years, and I read it a couple more times before this presentation. And I have to say, I saw a lot of myself in there, and I saw my family members represented, the people that I grew up with, the farmers, et cetera, that I grew up with. And I'll mention that I grew up in a small town as well, just like Edgar Lee Masters, kind of a similar town. Okay, so let me first of all just tell you a little bit about the book. For those of you who are not aware of the book, about the basic premise, about the diction and the language of the book, and then also about the form of the poems, because I think that's quite interesting. And so on this screen here, you can see on the right, that's Edgar Lee Masters, probably around the time that Spoon River was published, 1915. And then on the left, you see one of the covers of one of the editions. There are quite a few of them, and I have probably 5 or 6 at home. But as you can see, on the front cover is a cemetery and gravestones. And that's because there are 244 poems in the book, and there are 244 individual speakers. And each speaker of the poem is actually a resident of the fictional Spoon River Cemetery. And so essentially what it is Masters has given them license, has given them a little bit of life. There is some suggestion that there's an afterlife. They're speaking from somewhere. Sometimes they seem to be speaking from the ground. They're talking to people who are walking by. Sometimes they make reference to maybe being in heaven, or I'm going to mention one in a little bit who mentions that he's in hell, that he's in Hades, right? But there's an afterlife of some kind. And he's given them the opportunity to make one final statement, sort of conclusive statement about their life. And he's not given them a lot of space. I don't think in the edition that I love, there's a single poem which is more than a page. Some of them are longer than others. Some of them are very short. Some of them are, 10 lines. Some of them are 20 to 30 lines. That kind of varies depending on their level of articulateness and level of education, their position in life. And so Masters is definitely using poetic license in the book, but he's also basing them on people that he knew growing up, family members, people from the past, especially that his mother told him about in the area from Illinois where they're from. Some of them, quite a few of them actually, are alter egos of Masters himself. A lot of poets in this small town, which is kind of interesting. Only a poet would devise that, probably. Most of them, even though they're not actually alter egos of Masters, are actually voicing concerns of Masters himself. And I'm going to finish this by saying that ultimately this is a book about Masters, maybe more than anyone else, about the things which disturbed him or the conflicts that he had growing up, his thoughts in general. I think we can say of great artists and great writers. I'm going to put forth Emily Dickinson, one of the great American poets, or Charles Dickens. When you read their books, their voice, their character, their personality is so powerful that you feel like they're in the room with you, right? You read Charles Dickens, you can feel his presence in the room. And when you read Emily Dickinson, I can feel her presence in the room. She's alive in the time that I'm reading the poem. And I think that's also true of Edgar Lee Masters, that by the time you get to the end of the book, if you paid attention and you've done the necessary pausing and reflecting, you get a sense of him, ultimately, that his presence is here. Like I say, his presence is in the room. Let's see here. I'm going to go to the next slide. So here's some notes. Poem often addressed the living who knew them and are those walking through the cemetery. And he refers to them oftentimes, or they refer to them oftentimes, as traveler or passerby, sort of underscoring the fact that we're all sort of passing through for a very short time, and then we're going to be in the same position that they're in. These poems, 244 poems, were originally serialized in the Reedy Mirror, which is a St. Louis area newspaper over the course of 1914 to 1915. So they were written very, very quickly in a very short time. And I think this is going to be evident when you read the book that it's a little bit uneven, all right? He didn't do a lot of revising. He wrote very furiously. And some of them are better than others. Some of them are really, really powerful, and some of them you think maybe could benefit from a little additional revision. It's an uneven book, I'll say. It's a masterpiece. It's a classic, but it's a flawed masterpiece. But we could say that of a lot of other books, like Huckleberry Finn. But I don't want to go into that, all right, if you've read Huckleberry Finn. And then it says, as single volume, Spoon River Anthology was published in 1915, one of the most popular books of poetry in American literature, and that is true. That's kind of an oxymoron, a popular book of poetry. You know, popular not just with other poets, not just with academics, but actually popular with the general public. It actually ran through a number of editions very, very quickly. And as I say, you can still find it on the bookshelves today, over 100 years later. So that's quite a feat, ultimately. All right. A couple other notes. It was shockingly frank in 1915 because the dead do not respect inhibitions or taboos. They have nothing to lose. I'm just going to tell you the truth now. In life, I wouldn't have been able to, but now I'm in some sort of afterlife, and I'm going to tell you the truth. And so the poems deal with a lot of subjects which we're more capable of dealing with today and talking about, like sexuality and sexual abuse, and rape and domestic violence, even murder appears in the book. And what's interesting is that you know, death has provided many of them with clarity and the ability to articulate their thoughts, but it hasn't apparently given them, in many cases, a sense of peace. They're still very much consumed with the life and oftentimes with their death. It's like the defining moment of their life, I guess, is the last moment of their life. Also, the poems are loosely organized, I would say very loosely, from those trapped or defeated by a number of factors like you know, their own actions, their own flaws, fate, circumstance, the people around them, to those at the end of the book who might achieve, at least temporarily, some level of transcendence. And so I want to read some poems along the way from the beginning of the book, and then maybe refer to at least a couple of poems at the end of the book to show you that transition. And you can find all of these poems online probably, because that's the age of the internet. But I would advise reading them in sequence. There is a narrative progression from beginning to end. And then lastly, it says it's a composite portrait of a community in a specific time, place, and social context. Definitely, yet ultimately, as I said before, it seems to be about human experience. There's a universal quality to the book. Right? And here's a quote from William Reedy, who was actually the publisher of the Reading Mirror, and he was one of the first supporters of Edgar Lee Masters. He published in his newspaper, when newspapers would publish poetry, and was also one of the first ones to recognize its uniqueness and the power of the book. So anyway, and he said, Masters was impressed by the life of the people who were very close together. Everyone knew everyone else, and the ramifications of family relationships, the multitudinous drama of neighborhood gossip, the ups and downs, successes and failures of the people. He saw and knew his Spoon River so well that when he came to write out of himself, with his personality added to what he saw and knew, and as I say, ultimately he's the subject. He's sort of behind all of these portraits. He wrote the life of man everywhere, or at least everywhere in America, and I would extend beyond that. I think it's ultimately about human experience, period. Right? So, okay. All right, now a few notes about the language, all right? And it is very different. This is published around the turn of the century, and this is when free verse really became in vogue. Most of the poetry published in the 20th century and now the 21st century is free verse, which means it doesn't follow a regular stanza pattern, it doesn't follow a regular rhyme pattern, lines are not measured in syllables, but good free verse, and I think this is true of the best examples from this book, they have a power and they have a music. There is music. Poetry is a form of music. And if you're not using all of those elements of sound and rhythm relating to non-free verse, you have to find a way to make the poetry sing. And I think the best of these poems do sing. They do have a sense of music. They do have a sense of power. They do have a sense of eloquence. Right? But the language is plain, oftentimes, and flatly realistic, because he's trying to approximate the rhythms, the speech of the Midwestern dialogue, the way people would actually talk in 1915 in a small town. Many of them, again, uneducated. Right? You don't have to suspend your disbelief. Right? Like, for instance, in Shakespeare's Othello, Othello says at one point, rude am I in speech. Well, you're not rude in speech if Shakespeare is writing the language for you, right? And then also I want to say a couple of notes about the form, because I think form is important. In my poetry class at the beginning of the semester, we talk about various aspects of poetry, and one is form. That the form of the poem, the way it's organized on the page, should somehow complement the meaning of the poem, the ideas of the poem. They're working in conjunction with each other. And so I think that's the case here, that they are complementing each other. So as I said, the poems are brief, a single stanza. They're not divided into stanzas except for the first one, The Hill. So it's like one block of thought, kind of like one block of granite, right? Which will be important. It says one poem per page, leaving a significant amount of white space on the page. And that's one of the things that distinguishes poetry in general, because prose writers tend to fill up the page with words, sorry. There's space in the margins and there's space between paragraphs, but prose writers tend to fill it up. Oftentimes, even though poets do that sometimes, poets leave white space on the page. And we talk about this in my poetry class, that maybe the white space represents what you have to bring to the poem. It's an invitation for you to participate. You have to fill in the gaps, right? Poets don't always tell you everything. They leave gaps. Maybe they give you 50% and they expect you, challenge you to give the other 50%. And if you're not willing to do that, then move along and I'll wait for some reader who is willing to rise to that challenge. And then we also talk about forms, and I think this relates to the poems of Spoon River. And that is, we talk about a form called a concrete poem, which uses the shape of the subject as the form of the poem, right? And so here are a couple of examples. This is from a book called Types of Shape by John Hollander, published in 1969. All of them are concrete poems. And John Hollander is a great poet. And if I had time, I would read this for you, or maybe I should have passed it out to you, and you could read it on your own, and you would know that he's a powerful poet, right? The power of this poem does not depend on how it's organized on the page, right? I don't know that it's really contributing that much, except for an extra level of visual pleasure. It's visually pleasurable to look at the poem on the page. Here's another one. This is about a light bulb, and so it's shaped in the subject of, shaped the way a light bulb would be shaped. All right? And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the poems in the book Spoon River also resemble concrete poems. As I say, they're usually short. Some of them are longer than others, just like in a cemetery. But they sort of represent gravestones, headstones in a way, right? And when you take a look at the grave, the most important text of the gravestone would be, or the headstone would be, the name at the top. And it's always really powerful. Both of my parents are gone, and when I go to the cemetery and I walk up to their graves and I see their names, it's very affecting, right? And there's a certain power in thumbing through the book and seeing those names at the top, because the title of each poem is just the name of the person who's speaking, right? And they're sort of naming them. And so there's a lot of white space on the page here, as you can see. And if this were my poetry class, I would probably ask for opinions on what the white space might represent. So, sorry. So yeah, I think it's an invitation for you to participate, to think about what this individual has provided for you, the insight that's offered by this person. Think about their life. Another thing that this white space does is tend to slow you down, I think, as you're reading through the book. So as you're going from the first poem to the 244th poem, you're walking through a cemetery, right? And you're looking at these graves, and the people in the graves are speaking to you. And it's very difficult to read poem after poem very quickly. I think that white space, like I say, tends to slow you down and give you time to pause and reflect. because I don't think anyone walks through a cemetery very quickly, right? It's a slow, contemplative walk. You're pausing over the individuals that you've come to visit, but I also continue to walk around the cemetery, and oftentimes I'm walking by people who died in the Paola Cemetery, 1860s, 1870s, and I know that no one alive remembers anything about those individuals, right? And so that's the great thing about the book, is he's sort of resurrecting them, at least for a short time. And then also we can think about the people in our lives who are now in graves. They're no longer living, all right? Okay, just a couple of notes about Edgar Lee Masters. He was born just after the Civil War, 1868. He died in 1950, so he lived a fairly lengthy life, 81 years. He actually died in a convalescent home at the age of 81 in poverty, which might tell us something about the way our culture then and now supports poets and artists. Let's see, one thing I was going to say is his family tried to establish a homestead in Garnett, and it failed, so they left almost immediately after he was born, moved back to Illinois where they were from. It's kind of interesting. You could go to Garnett, Kansas today, and you could walk around and talk to everyone that you meet, and I doubt that there's anyone who knows anything about Spoon River or about Edgar Lee Masters, certainly that he was born there. There are no markers memorializing this town as his birthplace. So he left and went to Illinois. His grandparents lived in Petersburg, and that's where they lived initially, and he sort of saw that as a lost paradise. He spent a lot of time there as a child, and that's actually a theme in the book, that, the old times, right? He spent a lot of time there, as I say, as a child, and he loved that place. Then they moved to Lewistown, and even though it was not very far away, he had very, very different feelings about Lewistown. It was a place of culture clashing. There was a New England element in town. It's only about 2,000 people. And there was also a Southern element in town, and there was a lot of, like I say, culture clashing. This was also reflected in his parents' marriage, because his mother was a very stern, religious New England woman, and his father was, a drinker and a religious skeptic, and so that's definitely reflected in the book, in the portraits of the book, the clashing of cultures. He had literary ambitions, but he also had ambitions to be a lawyer, to follow his father. So he attended Knox College for 1 year, but withdrew due to financial concerns. He kept studying on his own, and then he was admitted to the bar in 1891 and moved to Chicago in 1892, all right? And so this will be important later on, but in his early early adulthood, his idea was that he was sort of ashamed of where he had come from in a lot of ways, that it didn't prepare him for life, the life that he wanted. And so he tried to deny his small town roots, write about other subjects, and move to the city. And then, of course, as we know, via Spoon River Anthology, he eventually returned to his small town roots and agreed to write about them and achieved his literary success. And I would say also, maybe to some degree, a spiritual transformation. If we can get there, let's see how far I'm going here. All right, better keep going. I'm going to skip that. While in Chicago, he developed a successful law practice and actually partnered with Clarence Darrow for several years, I think from 1903 to 1908, and this is the famous Clarence Darrow, defense attorney, famous lawyer, civil rights activist, and most well known as the defense attorney in the Scopes Monkey trial of 1925. So he achieved success in business before he achieved success in literature. All right, skip that. All right, take a look at the handout which I passed out in front of you. I'm not going to read all of The Hill, but I want to read just a little bit. It sort of sets up the essay, or rather the book in a lot of ways. This is one of the first poems in the book. It's unlike all of the other poems in that the speaker is not a resident of the cemetery. It's actually the poet himself, and he's announcing a spiritual quest, right? He needs information. He needs insight, which apparently only the dead can provide. And so he's trying to summon them from the grave. And it's titled The Hill, maybe because the cemetery is actually on a physical hill, but also it's on a hill because he believes the dead are on a higher plane. That they gained insight by through their death and moving into the afterlife of some kind. I know someone whose mother wasn't sure what happened when people die. And she said whenever anyone passed away, she said, well, now they know the secret, right? And so these individuals know the secret, and they've gained other insight, presumably, and he is pleading for their aid in the hill. And so I'll just read a little bit. Again, setting up the book. Where are Elmer, Herman, Bert, Tom, and Charlie? The weak of will, the strong of arm, the clown, the boozer, the fighter, all are sleeping on the hill. One passed in a fever, one was burned in a mine, one was killed in a brawl, one died in a jail, one fell from a bridge, toiling for children and wife. All are sleeping on the hill. Where are Ella, Kate, Mag, Lizzie, and Edith, the tender heart, the simple soul, the loud, the proud, the happy one? All are sleeping on the hill. And then we're talking about their manner of death, and sexuality was a factor in many of their deaths, and sex is a powerful force which is examined in all of the various portraits, or many of the various portraits in the book. One died in shameful childbirth, one of a thwarted love, one at the hands of a brute in a brothel, one of a broken pride in the search for heart's desire. One afterlife in faraway London and Paris was brought to her little space by Ella and Kate and Mag. All are sleeping on the hill. So via the poems in the book, via his creativity and his imagination, via his willingness to search his memories and his experiences, in the book, the dead respond, right? And so then you have all those portraits, all those dramatic monologues in which they're talking to us as if we're walking through the cemetery, right? So in my poetry class, I don't quite talk as much about the book as I'm going to do here, but I do read a couple of poems as examples, and this is one of the examples, and these oftentimes do hit home. I can tell when I read them out loud. And here's one of them. This is only 10 lines. This is Amanda Barker. Henry got me with child, knowing that I could not bring forth life without losing my own. In my youth, therefore, I entered the portals of dust. Traveler, it is believed in the village where I lived that Henry loved me with a husband's love, but I proclaim from the dust that he slew me to gratify his hatred. And great poetry attempts to do something to you emotionally, right? It doesn't want you to leave you cold, right? It wants to engender some type of emotional response. And I think many of these poems do. They hit home. They have kind of a blunt sort of eloquence, right? I'm going to skip that one. The ironies of life are often explored. Again, these are poems from the beginning of the book, which means they're shorter, usually. This is Chase Henry. In my life, I was the town drunkard. When I died, the priest denied me burial in holy ground, the which redounded to my good fortune, for the Protestants bought this lot and buried my body here, close to the grave of the banker Nicholas and of his wife Priscilla. These are among the wealthiest and most esteemed members of the community. Take note, ye prudent and pious souls, of the cross currents in life, which bring honor to the dead who lived in shame. Okay. I might read one other one. I put this on here not remembering that this is an unmarked grave. So anyway, ignore that. So they do reference some kind of afterlife. And this is one where he's referencing the fact that he's in Hades, right? Spiritual, physical, not sure. And this is the unknown, yet aspiring ones. Listen to the story of the unknown, who lies here with no stone to mark the place. As a boy, reckless and wanton, wandering with gun in hand through the forest near the mansion of Aaron Hatfield, I shot a hawk perched on the top of a dead tree. He fell with guttural cry at my feet, his wing broken. Then I put him in a cage where he lived many days, cawing angrily at me when I offered him food. Daily I searched the realms of Hades for the soul of the hawk, that I may offer him the friendship of one whom life wounded and caged. Okay. All right. So what time? How we're doing on time? All right. Okay, so as I say, initially he decided that he didn't want to write about the small town and small town experience, but eventually he changed his mind. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One would be that he actually, in writing the book, was actually returning to some of his earliest writing experiences. He wrote for newspapers, a couple of newspapers, writing about small town events, but he also, for the Lewistown News, wrote obituaries. And so he was used to summing up lies very concisely and very clearly. He was influenced by a couple of books, including Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie, a great example of social realism. He actually developed a correspondence, and Dreiser kind of became a mentor in a lot of ways, along with poets like Carl Sandburg. There were a couple of poets and poems that probably influenced him as well. The German poet Goethe wrote a poem called The Dance of Death, in which a caretaker at a cemetery watches the dead rise from the grave and begin to dance about. And figuratively, maybe that's what's happening in Spoon River Anthology. The dead are dancing about, so to speak, with new life. Also, there was a poem by William Cullen Bryant, another of his favorite poets, called Earth, in which a speaker is listening to the dead begin to find a voice and begin to speak about their lives. I don't know if I should even bother with that. I think I won't. All right. Running out of time. So William Reedy, who published the poems in a newspaper, actually gave him two great pieces of advice. And one piece of advice was the old writer's axiom: write about what you know, right? Write about your small town experience. That's where you're from. It's going to be authentic. It's going to be organic, which he did eventually. And then he also advised him to read the Greek anthology. I think it just maybe 5 years before he started writing Spoon River Anthology. And the Greek Anthology is a collection of short pieces, very short pieces, from a lot of different writers over the course of a couple of 100 years. And oftentimes these are written in first person, just like the poems of Spoon River. They're summing up lives, and oftentimes from the perspective of the grave and the dead. Right, so I'll just read one of these. Okay. Here's one of them. This is actually not in the voice of the dead, but someone who's walking by in a cemetery and commenting on the dead. And it reads, "Not even now the old man is dead. Do clusters of the cultivated vine grow in his tomb, but brambles and the astringent wild pear that contracts the traveler's lips and his throat parched with thirst. But he who passes by the tomb of Hipponax should pray his corpse to rest and sleep." And so his character, his spirit lives on, and even in the grave there is no peace, which is often the case in the poems of Spoon River. Right? Okay. All right. There are some reoccurring themes. If I had more time, I could tell you about many others. All right. Here are a couple of them. I don't want to give you the impression that all of them are grim, right? Because some of them are opposite. Some of them are optimistic. They're by people who had happy lives and fulfilled lives. Okay. A couple of themes. Most of the troubled and unhappy speakers have a limited self-bound understanding of the world that doesn't allow for transcendence. There are things which are in the way, right, which have not allowed them to transcend, even temporarily or momentarily. Others, like Masters himself to some degree, struggle for self-realization due to interior and or exterior forces often hidden and complex. Skip that. Okay. Actually, if you would turn in your handout to the second poem. Okay. Some speakers do achieve transcendence, right? Maybe because they're open to it. Maybe because they're seeking it, right? Like Masters himself in The Hill. Maybe because they're aware that it could be at any moment around them, even in the air, right? Or maybe because they have faith, referencing the first name of this individual, Faith Matheny. Okay. All right. All right, I'm going to read it. All right. At first, you will know not what they mean, and you may never know. And we, presumably the dead, may never tell you. These sudden flashes in your soul like lambent lightning on snowy clouds at midnight when the moon is full, which is a lovely image, they come in solitude. Or perhaps you sit with your friend and all at once a silence falls on speech and his eyes without a flicker glow at you. You two have seen the secret together. He sees it in you and you in him, and there you sit thrilling lest the mystery with a capital M, stand before you and strike you dead with a splendor like the sun's. Be brave, all souls who have such visions, as your body's alive, as mine is dead. You're catching a little whiff of the ether reserved for God himself. And that's the insight that Masters is seeking in the book throughout. He's seeking that type of transcendence by eventually exploring his past and his own psyche. Right? And so I'm going to end with this. He's such an outsized presence in the book. There are 244 poems, and this individual, who is actually one of the editors of one of the editions, sort of saw the entire poem as a poem with 244 parts. Right? And it's really all, in essence, about Edgar Lee Masters himself, where he's exploring his own psyche, his own conflicts, right? And trying to, as I say, achieve some type of transcendence. His frustrations, his conflicts, and his aspirations. And so in the book, there are so many poems that deal with things that he was concerned with, right? He's using these voices to explore himself. So there are a lot of poems about childhood anxieties and yearnings. He was actually obsessed with death because his brother died at I think when he was 10 years old. He says of diphtheria after 3 weeks of torture. He watched his brother die in torture. Also, his best friend, I think just a year later, was trying to hop a train, and this is when they're 10 or 11 years old. He tried to hop a train and was killed. And that moment is actually memorialized in one of the portraits of the book. I was going to mention before, I don't know if he was actually influenced by them, but when I read these poems, I often think of the poems of Emily Dickinson about death. And Emily Dickinson often wrote about death. She was obsessed with death to a certain degree too. She lost most of her family members by the time she was middle-aged. Her second-story window actually overlooked a cemetery, and she watched a lot of funerals in progress, and often wrote poems in the voice of speakers who were looking back on the experience of being dead and what that experience was like. She didn't seem to have any fixed notions of death, and I don't think he did either. He often said that he was obsessed with death because he didn't have the surety that comes with religious convictions. He was a skeptic. He was an agnostic, so he feared death. So anyway, so childhood anxieties like that and yearnings, a lot of poems about writers and artists and musicians, poems about educational experiences because he was trying to achieve, he was trying to reach a higher plane, so to speak, as I mentioned before, in various ways. Political conflict within the town, and he was also concerned about the future of America, that he believed that America was lost to some degree, and we need to return to our Jeffersonian roots, I think he said at one point. Also, he had difficulties in his relationships with women, partly due to the numerous infidelities, right, which tends to create some conflict, definitely. So there are a lot of idealized females and also a lot of romantic / sexual conflict. And then finally, a lot of poems about religious and also philosophical questioning. He had a lot of questions. I think he had more questions than he had answers, and maybe that's the really task of a poet, is to ask questions, not necessarily to find the answers, all right? Okay, so take a look at the last poem on your handout. My copy. There we go. So this is the next to last poem in the book, and as you can see, it's much longer, and the language is definitely more elevated and heightened. Right? There's a difference between the poems at the end of the book as opposed to poems at the beginning, and this is Masters really himself talking about this. Maybe the completion of his spiritual quest that he announced in the hill at the beginning of the book. And this is a poet speaking, and so he's using metaphor and symbolism. And remember the poem at the beginning, which was the hill? In this one, he is attempting to climb a mountain. Right? And he wants to get to the top of the mountain, and he's going to reach symbolically for the star. And many people say that reaching the star and touching the star indicates that he has succeeded in his spiritual quest, and that is the writing of this book, Spoon River Anthology. He actually touched the star. He never touched the star again. The only book which now is read, and he wrote 20-odd books, as I said before, after Spoon River, is a continuation of the book, which is the new Spoon River. I think I have a photo of it there, this one. It's actually quite a powerful book, too. It just came out as it was the sequel, and it didn't have the same effect, and didn't have the shock value that the first one had. It wasn't quite as unique. It's just a continuation of the previous one. So, but I would highly recommend this one if you want to read Edgar Lee Masters. Probably read this one, and obviously read Spoon River Anthology. All right? So it sort of shows the progression of the poems in the book. And you think I have time to read it, or you want to just go? Okay, I'll end it on this note. I'll make a few comments along the way too, but anyway. This is Elijah Browning. I was among the multitudes of children dancing at the foot of a mountain. We're not talking Spoon River anymore, all right? We're talking figuratively speaking, symbolically speaking. A breeze blew out of the east and swept them as leaves, driving some up the slopes. All was changed. Here were flying lights and mystic moons and dream music. A cloud fell upon us. When it lifted, all was changed. I was now among multitudes who were wrangling in conflicts of his early childhood. Then a figure in shimmering gold, and one with a trumpet, and one with a scepter stood before me. They mocked me and danced a rigadoon and vanished. All was changed again. Out of the bower of poppies, a woman bared her breast and lifted her open mouth to mine. I kissed her. The taste of her lips were like salt. She left blood on my lips. I fell exhausted. This is maybe his difficult romantic relationships. I arose and ascended higher, again trying to reach the higher plane, but a mist as from an iceberg clouded my steps. I was cold and in pain. Then the sun streamed on me again, and I saw the mist below me hiding all below them, and I, bent over my staff, knew myself silhouetted against the snow. And above me was the soundless air, pierced by a cone of ice, over which hung a solitary star. And as I say, that's maybe his realization of his literary aspirations. That's often the way it's interpreted. A shudder of ecstasy, a shudder of fear ran through me, but I could not return to the slopes. Nay, I wished not to return. For the spent waves of the symphony of freedom lapped the ethereal cliffs about me. Therefore I climbed to the pinnacle. I flung away my staff. I touched that star, via this book perhaps, with my outstretched hand. I vanished utterly, for the mountain delivers to infinite truth whosoever touches the star. As you can see, major difference between the early poems and the poems at the end of the book. Anyway. In many ways, I'm sure. All right, so thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate it, and you would do me a great service if you would read this book and absorb it, think about it, and reread it again in the future, definitely. I certainly come back to this book to remind me of a lot of things. I grew up like Edgar Lee Masters in a small town. And when I talk about Edgar Lee Masters, it seems like sometimes I'm talking about myself, because I was kind of ashamed of being in a small town and felt that it didn't really prepare me for what I wanted to do. But along the way, there were books that served as mentors to me. And I started writing about small towns as a result of Edgar Lee Masters and a couple of others. And I continue to return to the book over and over again for various types of sustenance, I think. All right, so. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Tom. If you have a question, I'd love to bring the microphone to you. We probably have time for a few.
Don't make it a hard one, Brian. All right. Right.
Yeah, well, evaluation.
All right.
I don't know how
Okay.
We've already done our evaluation, so it's fine.
How about I'll have to think about that, Brian? No.
I just
Whatever you
wonder
say.
if it's 1915. It's pretty early to be considered a modernist text,
Right.
But it does seem to have a lot of those traits, right?
Absolutely.
So where do you kind of situate it in terms of its literary landscape in the States?
Oh goodness, that's a tough question. I think it's ahead of its time, definitely. I don't know that I can say too much more about that, quite honestly. Any other questions? All right, no. How do you see it?
I've always thought of it as a modernist text.
Yes.
Like, because Joyce is writing around this time, right? And
Yes.
so it's not too early necessarily.
Right.
But I feel like it's always grouped in with realism, right?
Mm-hmm.
With
Absolutely.
Stephen
Yes.
Crane. And,
Yes.
But I just think it's so strange in some ways that it seems kind of modernist. But I don't know. There are poets here who would know.
Right.
Bob will know.
Let's go with Bob. Yeah. All right, Bob.
Any other questions?
So, hey, Tom, could you just talk a little bit about how you, like, what kind of activities you might set up with your students on this? Because I'm really interested about, I like the idea that the student will read a shorter poem and can get engaged that way. Can you talk a little bit about how you teach it in your class?
I haven't developed any activities based on the book, but I'm trying to think of, possible assignments that I'd have to think about that probably, how to incorporate this into a poetry class. I do mention this early on when we're talking about various types of poems, like epitaphs, for instance, and I say this leads me to think of this particular book, and we spend about maybe 20, 25 minutes talking about it generally, some of the points that I tick off, but I haven't actually used, probably I would use it more in a creative writing class for that purpose, but I haven't really developed any assignments related to that. I probably have to think about that just a little bit, yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Tom. So I think one of the things that you kind of mentioned early, but you didn't go into it much, is how this cast of characters in this small town is related to each other. And as you read the book, you get a larger sense of the relationships between the different individuals who lived in this town and are now residing in this graveyard. And in that regard, it's with this cast of characters, and it feels like a cycle of poems, right? I mean, as we saw at the end, we've got the one critic who's saying, well, no, actually, it's all one large poem, very much like Leaves of Grass, just continuing itself. But it's also one of the first, I would say, probably the first entire book of poetry that is definitely written in that cyclical format, so much so that many people believe that it inspired Sherwood Anderson later. This book appeared in 1915. Winesburg, Ohio comes out in 1919, and we're dealing with a small, small cast of characters in a small town on a prose side. How has this book influenced other poets writing cyclical style poetry? Do you think it has? I mean, do you have other instances or knowledge of that?
It's kind of unique in that way. Actually, his original conception was to write a novel with a very large cast of characters, and eventually sort of morphed, for some of the reasons I had mentioned, and who knows for other reasons as well, morphed into this collection of dramatic monologues by all of these individuals. But you're right, there are a lot of connections between the two. Maybe I didn't make that clear, but it wasn't the case of Amanda Barker, who talked about her husband, that her husband slew him. And oftentimes in the book, the next poem would be the husband giving his truth. This is her truth, he's going to give his truth. But that actually wasn't the case with Amanda Barker. Apparently he was buried somewhere else, or he's still alive, right? Probably still alive. She died very young, as we know, yes, yeah. So I don't know if that's influenced. It's probably a very difficult task. As I say, he wrote very furiously for a period of 2 years. In fact, I think we would probably characterize it as kind of a nervous exhaustion or some kind of nervous breakdown. He actually said, I would have continued the book if I didn't become ill. It took him a while to recover from the writing of this book. Like I say, it sort of possessed him in a lot of ways. So, I've never actually tried to write something like that, although he inspired me to write about small towns. I think it would be very, very difficult to do this. I've actually thought about trying to edit a book with a lot of various writers, and it would be sort of a modern day Spoon River, right? Written by various poets, each one writing an epitaph, again with the name of the individual, and maybe set it in a specific town. I don't know if I could ever pull that off or not. I couldn't do it myself. It would just take too much. What's that? Student exercise. There you go. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Anyone else? Probably got time for one more. Well, happy Poetry Month. Thank you, Tom.